Imagine having your own ChatGPT running entirely on your local machine, storing every conversation you have ever had and letting you jump right back into them anytime you want. With this app, you can continue the past conversation just like ChatGPT, switch between different LLM providers and models from fully local Ollama to cloud providers like Groq and OpenAI. Save all your past conversation in a built-in database so nothing gets lost. And the best part, we will build this together step by step with a fast API backend and a Streamlit frontend and a clean, simple database so you have complete control over your chatbot. So this is what we are going to build in today's video. So first we will try to understand the different features, as I've said to you, the tech stack behind this, and the front end part, which is the Streamlit user interface, and a backend that is powered by FastAPI, where we would connect to different LLMs and we would try to store this conversations in a tiny DB setup, and we would kind of work from there. So this will be the agenda for today's video, and let's get started. So I'll open my PyCharm where I have my code ready, and let's discuss about this. So I have my UVCon FastAPI backend running in one terminal, and another terminal tab I have my Streamlit app running. So that's what you are seeing in that Chrome browser. So here in this techstack.txt, I've just like listed down what are all the different tech stack that I have used. Of course, Python to build our entire application. So it's completely in Python, even accessing the DB and everything. And for LLM, we'll be mainly using Ollama so that our application will be completely on our local machine and the LLM is hosted on our local machine, but it is configured in such a way that the user can use cloud APIs like Groq or OpenAI. And also within Ollama, you would have like different options to choose from, and even in Groq and OpenAI, we would give options to choose like different models of the user's choice. So Llama index will be the main orchestration library that we'll be using. So FastAPI would be our backend and the API infrastructure that we will build, and Streamlit for our front end, and TinyDB, which is kind of like a simple DB that kind of acts as a DB where you create a file called as chat.db in your local and all the conversations are stored there. But you can easily scale this up. You can replace TinyDB with like MySQL, Postgres, or other databases as well. Similarly, if you want to move to a proper front end, instead of Streamlit, you can just build a front end alone, as we have a separate backend for our application. So this is the tech stack that we have. So next I'll open my requirements.txt and I'll show you what are all the libraries that we have. So first we have requests. So this request library is used in order to access the APIs. So as I said, we are hosting our fast API, API endpoints over here. To run that, we have our UVCon setup, and in order to access this from Streamlit, we have this request library, and then we have Streamlit for our front end, fast API for the API inputs, Pydantic endpoints, and Pydantic for the data schema and everything, Pydantic settings to load our configuration, OpenAI API key, and so on. We have UVCon, as I said, to start the API, Llama index LLMs, Ollama, Groq, and OpenAI. This would help us to use the different LLM providers and the models. And then we have python.env to store the API keys in our environment variables. And finally, we have TinyDB, which is like a very simple DB that you can create in a simple Python code. So these are all the requirements that we have. And as a first step, once you have cloned this repository, you can go ahead and install all the required dependencies. So you can simply run pip install -r requirements.txt. So I'm currently in this private ChatGPT app folder, which is my Git repository that I'll share this link with you. So make sure that you are inside this kind of project, and then you can run this pip install -r requirements.txt that has like all the libraries that we need. So as you can see, it says requirement already satisfied because I have already installed it. Okay, so this is the first step, installing like all the required dependencies. And now let's discuss and understand about the folder structure. So here I have a folder called as backend, and all my API and fast API code, like the LLM code, is going to stay here. And then I have a front end code that basically as my Streamlit app. So this backend as this main.py file, which we have to run in order to start our API endpoints. So that's what we have kind of executed in this first terminal. So if you see this, I ran this command called as UVCon here. So we have UVCon backend, which is the folder name, .main, which is the file name, and within the main.py we have FastAPI as initiated as app. So that's what we have given here, ubicon backend.main colon app. So this is going to start our FastAPI backend, so all the APIs will be available. So this is in our backend, and in the front end we have the Streamlit code, which is app.py. So this has like the complete Streamlit user interface code, which is running on my second terminal window. So here I have run the command Streamlit run frontend slash app.py. So this is what we have. So you have to install all the required libraries and then you can start this application, but also make sure that you have all the environment variables. So we have our API host. This means that our API is running on our local host, local machine, and it's going to run on port 8000, and this is the DB path. So what you have to do is we also have a directory called as data. So that would have this chat.db file, and then there is a placeholder.txt. This is nothing, I just wanted this so that git folder is not empty. So what happens is, like, you don't have to create this chat.db, you just need to have this data folder. This chat.db file will be automatically created when we start and send questions to our applications, and then when it answers, so it automatically gets created. But make sure you have the data directory, and in this env file, in this db path, you have to put the entire path of the data directory. After that, put slash chat.db. So once you have this, our application is going to pick the db path from here, and it will create the chat.db, the tiny db over here, and it would use that to store our conversation accesses and so on. And in the tiny db, we are creating a table called as conversation table. In order to have all these things configurable, we are putting this in the env file. And then we have OpenAI API key and the Groq API key. So in case you want to host these cloud providers along with Ollama, but again, you can just like ignore this or have just like an empty string, because if you, in case you want like only the Ollama models in it, so that's the idea. Okay, so this is what we have in our env file. So first, install all the libraries. Second part is like have all these env values populated correctly. The things that you have to change are your db path based on your system, where is the data directory, so you have to do that. If you want OpenAI and Groq, you can just like get your API keys and put it over here. If not, you can just have some empty string or some placeholder value. So this is the next step. Okay, so that's about that. And then we within this backend, we have this config directory, where we have a file called as models underscore config.yaml. This is basically the details of the different providers and the LLM options that we are going to provide for the user of our chatbot. So here, if you see, I have a kind of a key called as LLM that has different options: Ollama, Groq, OpenAI. So in this Ollama, we have Mistral 7B and Gemma 2 billion. So I wanted a 7 billion version and a Gemma like a smaller version, 2 billion version. So if you have a very small GPU or a CPU, you can just have this 2 billion version alone, as the 7 billion may not be loaded in your machine if you have a very small GPU, or if even GPU is not present. So go with a smaller model. So Groq, you can mention like whatever LLMs you want access to, and similarly OpenAI, you can just like list the models that you have access to as well. So I'll come back to my Google Chrome. So when I click on the settings, right, this is my model settings, my LLM settings. When you click this, you have provider as like Ollama, Groq, OpenAI, and so on, right? This Ollama, Groq, and OpenAI, these three things we are setting it up from this YAML file. So you have this backend. So this backend would have an endpoint where the frontend would access it, and it gets the details on what are all the different providers, Ollama, Groq, and OpenAI, and what are all the different models that are available here. So this is served in the form of a API. So the Streamlit app would call this API, and it would fills all these values from it. And from this, the user can select the model and the provider of their choice. Provider is either like Ollama, Groq, or OpenAI, or they can just like choose one of these, and they can choose the models as well. And when they click on the settings button again, it will kind of disappear, and it will be configured whatever model that they choose. If I want Groq, I would just like choose Groq over here, and some different models would work. But the main aspect here is make sure that you have all the Ollama models available. If you mention Mistral and Gemma 2 billion, but if you don't have it in your machine, then this is not going to work. I'll show that to you as well. So I'll open my terminal. So as you can see, Ollama is running in my machine. So make sure Ollama is running, and here I'm going to run Ollama space list. So this says that I have these models: Llama 3.23 billion, DeepSeek R1 1.5 billion, and so on. Maybe I'll just like make this a bit larger so that it's easy to see. Okay, so these are the models that I'm using: Gemma, 2 billion and Mistral 7 billion, but even I can use like the other models as well, Llama 3.2 and so on. So whatever the models that you have in your Ollama environment, you can basically like use it. Okay, so I'll close this. And similarly, Groq, you can just like list the models you want and the OpenAI models that you want. So that's the next step. So these are kind of like the configurable things that you can change. One is your env variable, the other one is your models config. So make sure that you list only mainly this Ollama part, like what are models you have access to, use that. So if you want to use Groq or OpenAI, you just make sure that you have all those keys configured in your env variable. So that's about that. So yeah, these are the main kind of like architectural designs that we have. We have a separate backend, we have a separate data directory, and then we have a front-end directory. Okay, so that is about like the structure of it. So now let's understand the different APIs that we have and how this is connected to the Streamlit app that we have. Okay, so I'll come back to this terminal. As I said, this is the step to run the API backend. In order for you to access this easily, right? So I'll maybe create a file called as steps.txt and put the command start. So the first step is pip install -r requirements.txt, and the next step that you have to do is create .env file with appropriate values, variable values, and then you have to run this uvcon backend.main.app in order to run your start your API backend, and then you can run Streamlit run frontend app.py in order to run your Streamlit application. Okay, so these are like the main step. Now let's go back and open our API backend. So as you can see, it runs on my 127. This is nothing but my local host, and it runs on the 8000 port. So I'll come back to my Chrome and I can go to that address, localhost/8501 is my Streamlit, and 8000 is where my FastAPI APIs are like hosted, and do a /docs once you start the API. And these are all the different models, like different API endpoints that we have. So first is the chat endpoint. So if you just like open it, right, so here there is a try it out option, and this gives you a detail on like what is the payload, what is the input that the front end should send to the backend. Here we have provided, because the user can just choose, like in this case if you see, right, they have asked a question on what is generative AI, explain in short, and the application. So if they want, they can just like choose a different model, and then they can ask a new question. So this last question will be answered by that specific model. So this is the chat endpoint, where it basically takes in the details of what provider should be used, what model should be used, the chat history, the entire chat history, so that the model gets a context, and then the main conversation ID, so that it can basically add it to the database, mainly for the database purposes. But this is the main thing: provider, model, and chat history. So based on this, the endpoint is going to give a output of response and the conversation ID as well. Response as in like what's the output. If the user is asking what is meant by machine learning, it would give this output JSON that contains the response and the conversation ID. Okay, so that is the first API that we have. And then we have this API provider models. So this API, I'll show you what it does. So I'll click on this, try it out. It doesn't require any parameters, so I can just execute and show it to you. The other endpoints may change the entries in the DB, so that's why I'm not running it from here, but this model I can run. So if I click on this execute, right, it would give you this response body. Ollama, these models are present. Groq, these models are present. And OpenAI, these are the two models present. So what happens is the backend already would have configured this YAML file, and then we have exposed this through an API called as provider model. So localhost 8000 API/provider model. So this Streamlit chatbot has a settings button, right? When we click this list of Ollama, Groq, and OpenAI. So all these are coming from this API that we have, and similarly the models also comes from that particular API call. So the Streamlit doesn't store any values, rather it calls this API for like all the details of the providers and the models and so on. So that is our second API. And then we have like get conversation endpoint. We first explain this endpoint, so that would make more sense. So this also doesn't require any input, so I can just like show it to you. So this gives you all the conversations that the user has had in this place. And also the other main feature that I forgot to mention is we would also give a title to this conversation. So here the user has asked what is generative AI, so we have given a title of generative AI explained. And if the user asks a question about machine learning, so we would give like titles based on the first question that they are asking using another LLM call. So we have like that endpoint as well, this title endpoint. Okay, so here when I click on this or execute this get all conversation endpoints, so it's going to give like all the conversation IDs that are stored in the DB as well as their titles. So this API endpoint is used in order to populate my older chat history. Okay, so here in this left navigation bar we have the chat history, right? Either the user can create new chat or they can access the older chat. In order to list all these older chats that's present in the tiny DB, we are using this localhost 8000 API conversations, and then this get conversation endpoint. So what happens is when the user clicks on the conversations like deep learning basics, when I double click this comes to the top, and here we have this deep learning basics, right? So what happens is when the user clicks on it, we call this endpoint called as API conversation ID conv ID. So that conversation ID goes in there and it returns that particular conversation. If I just show this one, right, get all conversation. So this one is about the deep learning is what we have clicked on, right? So deep learning basics. So this is the conversation ID. When I send the payload with this particular conversation ID and I'll click on this, try it out and click on this, give this conversation ID and execute, this is going to load this particular conversation. So the title is deep learning basics is what you are seeing over here. And then we have like the user's question and the assistant's message and so on. So everything is present over here. So this is the purpose of this conversation API. And similarly you can just like click other. So when I click this generative AI explain, it would call that particular conversation ID and we would access it, and then you can send a message. So when you send a message, this add message API is called over here, that you have the chat endpoint message is kind of like clicked and so on. So this is for getting all the conversation, and this is create conversation endpoint when a new message is sent, right? So in that case we call this create conversation endpoint. So in the DB it would create that conversation ID and it would be saved. So it is for that purpose. And then we have a title endpoint as well. In this title, the same model that the user has selected or configured over here is used. So here we have the settings button, right? If the user has, let's say, has selected a Groq and they have used the Llama 3.3 70 billion versatile model. So this is the provider details and the model details. And now I'll ask some questions like, why sky is blue? This is the question that I asked. So based on this, a new conversation would be created and we would assign a title to it as well, right? So we got a output over here. So if I can just like ask some other question or move to the next one. So here you can see the new conversation getting created, that is sky blue color explanation. So this title has been automatically created. That is using this title endpoint. So that is the other thing. And the add message endpoint is just to store each individual messages into our database that we have, the chat.db database that we have. So these are all the main six endpoints that we have. One is to main aspect or functionality of our application, which is giving answers to the user's question. So for that we have the chat endpoint, and to get the list of providers and models we have this provider models endpoint. And to get a specific conversation by means of a conversation ID, we have this get endpoint with conversation API / conversation, and then we have API / conversations that list all the conversation that we can populate in this left navigation bar. And a title endpoint is used to give title to particular conversation. And finally we have add message that's going to add the message to the DB. So these are all the different endpoints that we have. So next let's discuss about the code maybe. So let's understand this code, but I won't be able to explain like each and every line of code, as the volume of code is pretty big and we won't be able to do it in one single video. So I'll just try to like explain it in a high level overview of this. If you want a very detailed explanation, just let me know so that we can do it in a part by part video. But for now, I'll just like explain you about the different structures of our code and the purpose and the process that we are following. So that's what I'm going to do in the explanation part. So first I'll maybe open this backend. So in this backend, we have this LLM directory, right? Or maybe config is the best place to start. So I'll start from there. So in this config, I have an init file so that this can be kind of considered as a module and imported easily. So you don't have any files in this underscore init file. So it's kind of like a file that lets Python treat as this as module. So all the folders we can just like create init.py file. So in some directories I haven't created, but that doesn't have any meaning, so it's not nothing important in there. So first we have this config, right? In this we have this models config.yaml. So whatever configuration code or details that you have, you can put in this config folder. Similarly, in the front end as well, we would have a config folder that as like the front end config, whereas this as the backend config. As I said, the idea is we have a clear separation between the front end and the backend, so that in case you want to use like a different front end, right, or Node.js or some other front end application, you can just easily switch that. Just you have to give the front end person the APIs that you have built. So it's like pretty simple. So that's why we have separated it as well. So here in this config, we have this backend config, and we are going to use Pydantic settings, base settings. So here we are going to load our environment variable values. So what it basically does is, the purpose of this file is, right, we have a load.env and we run this from this project directory. So the project directory as this .env. So when this backend config.py is called, we would import this backend setting. So this would load all the values that's present in this env variable to the environment variable value, so that we can access it later that we want. And it also saves this to this backend settings variable. So it's like you call this and this would perform the work of loading these into the environment system environment variables, and the other one is like, you know, storing it in a variable called backend settings. Let's say that you want to access the db path, so that you can create the db in this data folder, right? So this would be accessed from settings, backend settings .db path. DB path. When you call that, it's going to load that. When you want the conversation table name, you can access it using this backend settings and so on. So this config directory has this configuration details for our application. Okay, and then we have this LLM directory, which has a LLM factory file. So this LLM factory file has a get LLM function, and that's going to kind of like load the models that you want. So here we have like, you know, Ollama, Groq, and OpenAI. And the main aspect that I've implemented is, it is kind of like a cached structure, where if you, for the first question, the user has, you know, selected the Ollama models gamma 2 billion, let's say that's the case. Now what happens is, this model will be the default model and it will be loaded. It won't be like kind of like changed, or it won't be loaded for like each messages, or it won't be selected for each message. So we have a cache that it's basically the model details are cached, and it is only changed when the user select a different model combination or a provided configuration. So the main idea here is, when the user says like, I want to Ollama and I want, let's say, a gamma 2 billion model, so we call this get LLM function. So this would kind of go through the list of models that we have, and from this it would return that LLM. So if the user is asking, you know, Groq's Llama 3.3, right? So here we would kind of call this current LLM, and we would assign this Ollama provider. So we have here we have the LLM provider, right? If the user is asking Ollama, then we call this LLM provider, pass their model. If they ask Ollama, this would be sent, which is Llama index Ollama. If they want Groq, then we send this Groq class to it, and then we would load the corresponding model that they sent. So it's like, this is how, in simple words, this is how it would be in this current LLM, right? When the user has given a particular provider, let's say Groq, this place would be replaced by this Groq value. If they give the mod within Groq, if they have Llama 3.3, this part will be model is equal to Llama 3.3. In runtime, this would be something like, you know, Groq of model Llama 3.8 billion. So this is how it would look like in the runtime. If it's Ollama, it's going to look like Ollama model Llama 3 billion, 3.8 billion, and so on. So this LLM provider is basically coming from this dictionary that we have created, and this dictionary has like the actual classes of Ollama, Groq, and OpenAI from Llama index. In simple terms, this get LLM is a LLM factory where you can just specify the provider and the model that you want, and it would return you like that actual LLM, on top of which we can just like send questions and get the answers. And then we have a service directory. This is where like all the business logic goes in, as in like, you know, how the chat is getting answered. If you see this, right, so here we are calling this chat message. This is just for that input output structure and so on. And from this backend.llm is just that folder that we have discussed. So we have that backend llm.llm factory. From that we are calling that get llm, and for each messages, as we have seen over here, the user would send like a provider and a model, right? So yeah, not this one, the chat endpoint, the user would send a provider and a model and the chat history. So that we receive here, provider, model, and the chat history, and then we send it to LLM chat. So this is like the llama index is like chat operation that we have. So we send the messages are nothing but the chat history that is processed into role and content, role, whether it's like user, whether it's assistant, and so on. So we send that information and we get the response, and this response is sent back. So this is one business logic. Similarly, we have the DB service logic where we add the message to this chat.db. So we have this chat.db in our data directory, right? So we have add messages, and then we have get conversation, get all conversation, create new conversation ID, create new conversation. So all these are the DB operations that we have. So when a new message comes, we kind of like create a new conversation from the Streamlit user interface. So we would have a separate endpoint for this. So as we have seen, so you have this create new conversation, right? So this would be basically using this function present in the services directory. So all these functions and the business logics goes in the services directory, and your API would in turn call your all the services that you have created. So if you see this API would call backend.services.chatqa. So and conversation DB services would have like all those endpoint, and then we have another endpoint called as title.py. So this title.py calls this backend.services.title, which is present over here. So this title.py as the logic of how you would generate a title if a user gives you a query. So as I said, this title is also used, basically generated by the model that the user has selected. So we send the provider details, model name, and the query. So based on this, we have created a prompt saying that generate a very short and concise title, maximum 5 words, for the following user query. Respond only with a JSON. This is for our output processing. Okay. So similarly, all this logic goes in the services directory, and in the API we have like all the endpoints that we have created. So in this router.post we have created this /title, right? So using this they can access this title endpoint. If you see over here, you're seeing this /API title, and here you can see how to access this. So this would be accessed within that localhost 8000 /API/title. So all those are kind of like configured in this API part. So once you have created all these APIs, you would mention those in the main.py file. So in this I have imported like FastAPI, chat router, all those things and so on. So all these APIs are imported here, all the routers are imported here, and to this API we would include like all the endpoints. So I'm including like the chat router for chat question and answer. This endpoint is for providing the models like provider details and the model details, conversation, title, DB, APIs, and so on. So all these are kind of mentioned here. So what happens is, this is the main API, and this API would redirect the data to this API endpoints, and this API endpoints would then redirect to this services that has like the business logic. This would call the LLM, get the output, do the operations, and so on. So this is like the standard structure that you would follow in a FastAPI project. So you have a API folder that controls or as the endpoints, configuration directory that has like all the config details. DB is mainly like the DB operation. DAO is like data access object. So there we are kind of loading our DB path, like starting the DB, creating the DB, and everything. So everything goes there, and we have created a chat store variable over here. This chat store is what will be used in this DB services. So if you see here in this chat DAO, so backend.db.chat DAO, so we are calling this chat store and the query thing, and then we would perform like all the operations over here. So this is like for that purpose. And utils, currently it's empty as we don't have any utils over here. So if there are some minor utils, you can put that in this thing so that your code is structured. So this is this entire thing. So you have a main.py file that starts the API and as like the different router configured over here, and each individual endpoints and the routers comes from this API directory, which in turn would call this services, and the services would have the business logic, DB as like all the DB related stuff, and config as the configuration details, the model configuration, and so on, and LLM directory as like the LLM structure and everything over here. So this is our backend. And our frontend is pretty simple for now, as we are using Streamlit. So it has a config. In the config, we have configured like what is the local host, sorry, what is the API host and the port. So it's not like we can host the APIs only on a local machine. In production, right, what would happen is like the API would be hosted on a EC2 instance, and you would give that particular host, let's say the IP address of the host over here, and you would give like at what port like the API is running. So you would configure all those things. And that's the config directory that we have, and this app.py is here, right? So from this, these are the import statement. So we have this request library using which we are going to access all the UVCon, the FastAPI endpoints that we have. So that's going to be accessed from this request library. And then we have Streamlit, of course, for the UI. Chat config dot frontend config, import this frontend settings. So this frontend settings is coming from here. So using this, I can access the API host and the port. The reason that we are accessing or using this is this can be configured from a env file. So if a host has been changed or a port has been changed, I can change this directly over here instead of making changes in my code. It's the best option to have it in a configurable way. So that's the main purpose. So here we have the basic page setup and all that. So this basic page setup as like this, icon over here, the name of the page, whether like you want this application to be in a centered way or in a wider space. So all these are controlled by this page title, page icon, and layout. And then the backend URL configuration. So these are the different APIs that we have. So here we have the API host, API port, provider models. So HTTP API host is localhost 8000. So in runtime, it's HTTP localhost 8000 API provider model. So it's basically accessing the provider models API that we have seen over here. So you have this, right? I'll show this to you. Provider models, we don't have any input output. So you see this, right? HTTP localhost 8000 API provider models. So this is what Streamlit is accessing by using this URL. So if you go to this main.py, in this provider models router, we have this one, right? If you click on this would take you to this provider models, right? So it says like /provider models, where it's present is within this API prefix. This one. So you have a API prefix, and within that you have this /provider models. So that would be the API endpoint for you to access like or get all the list of models and the providers. So that's what the Streamlit app.py is using. So you have the provider models, chat URL, and so on. And here we call this provider models URL. So what this does is what we have done in this place. So we have executed and got the list of providers and models, right? So this is basically done in this request.get method, and all this list of models and the providers are stored over here, and then we kind of use this. So you see the settings button, right? Model settings. So the user clicks on this, like we have the list passed over here, and then we also have like the models keys and the models values. So it's like you have one drop down for the models, which is this. So you have a select box, right? So this select box is nothing but when you click on the settings button, you would see this two select box. So you have first select box that has a label provider, and the second select box that has a label model, right? So that is coming from this place basically. So provider is equal to this is that label. So first, this is the first select box that show you Ollama, Groq, and OpenAI, and this is the list of models that we get. So all these are coming from this provider models, and this provider models is basically called from this request provider models URL and so on. So this is for the settings toggle, and then we have a bunch of session state. So this is to maintain the session states in the Streamlit app. So it's a very complex subject, but I'll just try to give you a short explanation on what it is. So in Streamlit, right, it's kind of like the state is not managed like in the exact way. So what happens is if the user selects, let's say Ollama, and they have selected Mistral 7B and they've closed this, right? When they click the button, all these values are kind of reset. We don't want that. If the user has selected Groq and if they have selected Llama 3.370 billion and closes, right, even when they open this, they should see the same values, right? So all these are saved in the form of a session state. So we have provider, models, chat history, show settings. So all these are kind of saved over here. So that's why we are kind of like initiating the session states, and when the app runs, like all these values are getting like saved over here. So that is this purpose. And then we have this model settings, that setting symbol, and we have seen like the two drop downs that we have, and this is the sidebar code. So we have the list of conversation, right? So we have a button called as new chat that's going to create a new conversation and all that, and here you have this conversation URL API getting called like for loading it, and if it's a new conversation will be created and so on. So this sidebar st.sidebar would create this sidebar that we are seeing over here. If you want, you can just like close this, so or you can open it. So you have this history, right, with this chat symbol. So that is coming from this place. So you are creating a sidebar, and we are using this conversations URL. So if you go to this conversation URL, it is this API conversation. So if you remember, this API conversation gives you the list of all the conversation that has happened. Get all conversation endpoints. So we have executed it, and it would return these three things, right? Understanding machine learning, generative AI, deep learning basis, which is called by this URL. So this is what we are configuring over here, this conversation URL, and that is getting called from this sidebar. So that's why this sidebar has like called this list of older conversation that we have. So that is the next step. So when a new chat is created, again a new fresh template is created, and then the user can send the messages. So here we have a for loop. In this for loop is used to display the older messages. So you have this chat history, right? So what happens is like this for loop is used, like when I click a conversation, you see like one user's question and one robot's answer, right? So if I click on this generative AI explain, so you see like one question from the user and the answer from the bot, and then you have like continuous questions and answers. So all these are stored in the chat history for that particular conversation, and that is being printed over here. So st.markdown shows that, and your for loop is used in order to display those messages for each of these conversation when the user clicks that particular conversation. And then we have a st.chat input, which is this bar that you're seeing in the bottom. So the user kind of clicks, types in something, and they send the value over here. So that's basically present in this st.chat input. So if the user types in something and they click on that send button, then like basically we just like create this payload of what's the model that they have selected, provider that they have selected, the model they have selected, and the user's text. This is then like when it is the first question, we try to get the title from the title URL, and then we also pass it to this conversation URL and the chat URL. So chat URL would be somewhere here. So request.post conversation URL. This is the conversation. So API chat is coming from the chat URL. So chat URL is present here, right? So we have this request.post, and we send the payload. Payload is like what's the provider, what's the model, and what's the chat history. So this is sent, and then we kind of get this, and so on. That's process is like pretty simple. And then once we get this response, right, from the chat URL, so we save this in a variable called as assistant response, and then we display it in this assistant response over here. And then you finally call this request.post add message URL. Add message URL is just to add this message to your DB. So all this kind of gets saved into your data folder chat.db file. So this is like the high level overview of this, as I said, which a bit harder to explain like each and every line of this code, but let me know if you needed like a detailed explanation of it. So that's about it. And I can show you on like how you can set this up in a new machine, so that like you are clear with that. Maybe before that I can just like type in some questions. I can show it to you. So let's say that we have this conversation, right? Sky blue color explanation. So when I double click it, or sometimes single click it, like it would come on top. So here I can continue the conversation and ask like, explain in short. So I don't want this longer conversation, so I can say explain in short. So this is going to give a shorter explanation. So if I want to create a new chat, I can ask like, something like, so you can also see the model. So I've already selected Groq Llama 3.370 billion versatile. So now let's say that I want to run this completely on local. I don't have Groq and OpenAI. So I can say Ollama. I already have Mistral 7B, so I choose this and I'll close this. Now if I'll ask a question, something like, what is an API? So this is going to take some time, as the model should load into the RAM and the GPU. So, but we can wait for that, not an issue. So this would be answered from Ollama. If you have noticed, Groq would be pretty faster as we know it. But again, depending upon your GPU and your machine, it can take time when you're running it on Ollama. So once we kind of like have the output or ask a continuing with some question, we will see like the new conversation created as well. So we have asked about an API, right? It's explained about API and all that. The second question, I feel like it would be answered quickly. So I'll say like explain in short. As you can see, it has created a new conversation called as understanding APIs, and it is bold now. So the current conversation will be bold, made bold. So yeah, we got the output. So I can just like choose this understanding machine learning. So it would come on top, and it would be like bold font. Okay, so you can similarly continue the conversation and work on it. If you want, you can also choose like go to the settings in this dots, you can go to the settings and make this theme as like light, so that like everything is white in color if you want the structure. So here you can clearly see this, bolder version. Okay, so this is how you can access this. So in this final step of this video, I'll show you how you can clearly set this application up in a new environment. So I'll just like stop the API, clear everything. Similarly, I'll stop the Streamlit application as well. So when I come back to this, it says connection error and everything. If I refresh this, the docs also won't work because we have stopped the Streamlit app as well as the API, right? So now I'll just like take this complete code, I'll put it in a different environment, and I'll show you how you can kind of start the application from there. So let's say that I am creating like a different project over here. So I'll go to this file and create new project. So I can create a directory somewhere. So I'll create it in this REC code, and I'll create a new folder and I'll call this as chatbot 2 or something. Okay, some name, or maybe let's put this as ChatGPT 2 or something. So here I'm creating a virtual environment and all that, custom virtual environment. So the directory should be present in the same path. So it should go into this ChatGPT-2 open, and I should say venv. So this is where I have this. So I'll create a new window. Let's say that you have created an environment, and now we have to get these files back here. And okay, let me open that. This is where my PyCharm is. Oh, did I give same thing? Okay, so here I am my chatbot. Okay, so here I'll copy the backend data, frontend, env, requirements.txt, steps and tech stack. Okay, so all these things, maybe you would probably like clone it. I'll just like show it to you in the steps. This is not working. I'll minimize this one and yeah, choose this ChatGPT to that I've created and paste it over here. Okay, so we have backend data, front end, env file, and all those things are there. So in this data, I'm going to delete this chat.db. Okay, so that our chatbot would look fresh. We won't have like previous conversations and so on. So the first step, as I said, is to install the requirements.txt. Now it says like the libraries are not installed. So here I'll go and say pip install -r requirements.txt. And this is going to install like request, Streamlit, Llama index, and all the libraries will be installed. So yeah, that's the first step. And once this is installed, you can start the API and start the Streamlit. But yeah, before that, we have to make sure that we have created a env file. I would suggest you to at least get Groq API kick, because you can just have like a free tier OpenAI. You may have to give some payment details and so on. So maybe just like stick to Groq API, but you can just like try with Ollama as well in your local machine. Update this DB path. This is very important. This is my local path, so you have to update wherever you have created your data directory. You don't have to have this chat.db file, but create the data directory and then have this chat.db file over here. Okay, so those are the next steps. The first is installing all the libraries, and the next one is like creating your env file. So let's say that these two steps are done. I'll clear this, and then you can just like go to the step.txt, and this has this uvcon backend main, right? In the first terminal, run this. Don't close this terminal. If you want, you can run this in the background as a background process, but for now I'll just like run this as uvcon backend dot main colon app. If I open the Chrome and now go to localhost swagger docs, so I would see the APIs over here, and in the next step I'll open another terminal here and say streamlit run frontend app.py. So this is going to start my Streamlit application. So I'll open that in my Google Chrome as well. So you can just like click this or copy this and paste it in your Chrome. So for me, it's starting in the Safari, so I'm just like manually opening it on Chrome, but for you, it would automatically start in your default browser. Oh, okay, I'm still seeing this. Let me see what's okay. Here's what happens. I just like didn't make that change. So this data chat.db is basically from the older DB that I've created. So I didn't update this path. This is the things that can go wrong. So I'll just like stop this from here. Clear this. If I come back to this Chrome, it won't have this running. Okay, that's okay. So here I'm going to delete this part, copy this entire path of this data directory and paste it over here and say /chat.db. So now this is a fresh DB, right? Let's see. So you have to stop this and restart the API if you are making any changes. And then again start the Streamlit application, Streamlit run app.py. As you can see, the chat.db file has been created, but it would be empty. So if I now come back to my Streamlit app and refresh this, now you don't see all those history, right? So that's the process, because we have cleared that and now we have this. So here, this is my new conversation. I can just like make it night mode so that it looks slightly better. So yeah, it is in dark mode. So here I can ask question on like, what is generative AI? So it would create a title, it would kind of give you the answer, and it would like save this in the history page. So the conversation that you click would kind of come on top and it would be highlighted just like how we would have in the ChatGPT application and all that. Okay, so currently this is running on my Ollama's default model, probably like Mistral 7B or the Gamma thing. Maybe I'll just like look what's the model that is getting used. So the first model that I have is Mistral 7B, so that is the model that will be used over here. Let's see. Yeah, so I got the output and so on. So I can just create a new chat and I can ask like some other question on, what is deep learning or so on, or I'll ask like, why sky is blue. Even I can continue the older conversation, change the models and so on. Let me change the model to Groq so that we get like the output pretty quickly. And click on the settings to close it. Why sky is blue. And then we would get like a quick answer as we have configured for Groq. So you can just like go to other conversation, come back here and so on. So the current conversation will be highlighted. Okay, or you can create a new chat and work on it. So this is how you can create your own private ChatGPT-like application. So I hope this is useful to you. Let's try to add like more features to this, as in like RAG applications and user-based chatbots and so on. So please try to do this on your machine, practice this code, and please let me know in the comments like if this is useful to you and what are all the kinds of videos that you want to see. So please subscribe to my channel and let's meet in the next video. Thanks for watching.